I have not been looking forward to making this video. Bug Fables is a spiritual successor to the first two Paper Mario games, hailed by the Paper Mario fanbase as equivalent or in many ways better than the official Paper Mario games. For those who don't know, both Paper Mario games number among my favorite games of all time. So this project feels like the sort of thing that was made for someone like me. In fact, Paper Mario but with a higher difficulty is the sort of thing I've dreamed of since I was a small child. And yet, when playing through Bug Fables, not only did I not find it enjoyable, but the more the game went on, the more actively miserable I got. In fact, we're less than a minute into the video, but let's do a quick sidebar because I think my experience with Bug Fables is actually a good example of why you shouldn't need to finish a video game to give a valid review of it. If I hadn't felt an obligation to play through it, I probably would have dropped Bug Fables midway through Chapter 3. At that point, the story had me a little bit interested, but the gameplay loop wasn't really clicking for me, and I had a bunch of frequent annoyances with areas where the game stumbled. However, I knew that having a negative opinion of a beloved game would be controversial, so I continued to push through my annoyances. My frustrations and annoyances continued to stack upon each other, and my feelings towards the game became more and more negative, until when I finally did drop it near the end of Chapter 6, I think it would be accurate to say that I absolutely despise Bug Fables. As it turns out, forcing yourself to engage with something that you dislike only makes you like it less. And for anyone who's convinced that playing through Chapter 7 would have caused my opinion to magically do a U-turn, don't worry. I watched a Let's Play. That final boss would not have done my opinions of the game any favors. And it sucks to feel this way, because believe it or not, I don't enjoy being a hater. I really wanted to like Bug Fables. I asked my friends for help with frustrating puzzles so I wouldn't dwell on them as long. Some people suggested I dial the difficulty down from hard to normal, so I started a new playthrough and played through the first two chapters on normal, and that didn't help things either. I even adopted the poison meta strategies that some people suggested to me would make the combat more tolerable. And I truly do wish that one of these was the magic fix that made Bug Fables click for me. As crazy as it sounds, I enjoy enjoying things. I wish I had liked Bug Fables. Not only because positive experiences are better than negative ones, but also because it shares so much DNA with Paper Mario 64 and the Thousand Year Door. And look, I don't want to spend the entire video ragging on an indie team's labor of love, especially because there is some good stuff in Bug Fables. So I want to start off by talking about the positives. The things that I liked, or the things that I think show potential even if they require a little bit more polish. And the easiest place to start is the story, or more specifically, the three main characters. The main story of Bug Fables is very similar to the story of the first two Paper Mario games. Our heroes are going on a treasure hunt for several MacGuffins that if they get them all together, they can get an even bigger and more powerful treasure. Just like in the Thousand Year Door, the overarching story is basically just serviceable, nothing special about it. Instead, the writing's real strength is on the individual chapter stories, with things like participating in a religious ceremony around a holy flower god, lifting the lockdown on a malfunctioning honey factory, and exploring the ancient ruins of a lost civilization. These scenarios are suitably wacky and charming, and while I personally prefer the individual chapters from Thousand Year Door, I will fully admit that no small amount of that is from nostalgia. Although, I guess now would be a good time to address the fact that at several points throughout this review, I will likely compare Bug Fables directly to TTYD. It is perhaps a slightly unfair comparison, as one is an indie game and the other one was made by a giant corporation, but it's a comparison that Bug Fables itself invites, with the battle system, papercraft aesthetic, and even several Easter eggs specifically referencing the Paper Mario games. But I think the biggest justification for these comparisons is sometimes there are ways in which Bug Fables surpasses its predecessor. And case in point, from a story perspective, Bug Fables consistently succeeds in an area which the Paper Mario games consistently fails, and that is the characters. Standouts for me include Koops, Bo, Vivian, and Bobbery. all of whom have amazing character arcs and stick with you for the remainder of the story. But there are two major and related problems with the way that Paper Mario approaches his character design. The first is that characters' stories tend to be isolated to the chapter that you meet them. This both limits the complexity of possible stories, and, perhaps more importantly, feeds into my second major problem: the characters just don't interact with each other. Sure, you can have Baby Yoshi yell at Bobbery before you recruit him, and Goombella has a tattle on Vivian, but for the most part, once they're recruited, Mario's partners exist just to dump some exposition in the story. And that's a shame, because one of the joys of having multiple likable characters is seeing the ways in which they bounce off of each other. And that's one of the big strengths that Bug Fables has. The story's three main characters are Kabu, V, and Leif. And while all three of them are fun to spend time with individually, I think the ways in which the party interacts is what elevates them to be such a lovable trio. For example, V is an excitable goofball who often gets angry at others, and this short fuse led to tensions between her and her sister. However, the resolution of this plotline doesn't just involve V, but her two friends Kabu and Leif as well. Both because they are the ones who push V to try to reconcile, and because their acknowledgement of her growth as a person, insect, means something. You've seen these three interact and their friendships grow over time. And so, while V's character growth is touching on its own, it's made all the more so by her friends acknowledging it. On Kabu's end, his storyline primarily revolves around overcoming trauma that happened when he left two of his friends to die journeying to Bulgaria. Overcoming the beast in order to save his new friends is a narratively satisfying end to that storyline, and it wouldn't be possible if it weren't for the emphasis the game placed on the found family and their interactions with each other. And the pattern of character interactions supplementing their individual stories continues with Leif, as Leif has a crisis of confidence upon learning their secret origin and their true identity. But they are talked out of a doom spiral by their friends, with V and Kabu's acceptance is ultimately what gets Leif through the crisis and allows them to be grounded and confident enough to approach their family. And I do want to take a moment to focus in more closely on Leif and how their story is a very positive step in terms of representation. Okay, so massive spoilers for one of Bug Fables' bigger plot points. There are chapter timestamps below if you want to skip this portion. Okay, we good? Everyone who cares about spoilers is gone? Cool, let's talk about Leif's plotline. When Kabu and V first encounter Leif, they are tied up in a spiderweb. After being rescued, Leif immediately begins acting odd. They are apparently the only surviving member of an expedition over 100 years ago, and they speak in an ancient roach language that predates even their birth. They're also somehow able to do ice magic, and they have some missing or confusing memories that they really can't explain. If the player pursues Leif's side quest, they will eventually find their way into an ancient roach lab. Here we learn that Leif actually died in the expedition, and their consciousness was taken over by a cordyceps fungus, which was developed by the roach scientists in some sort of weird experiment that's not really important for our purposes. I cannot speak to developer intention, but many aspects of Leif's storyline are similar to the experiences that plural people go through. For those unaware, the term plural is used to refer to when multiple consciousnesses can exist in a singular body. For example, as a result of dissociative identity disorder. I will fully admit that this is a topic I have very little knowledge around. So rather than risk spreading misinformation or saying something offensive in my ignorance, I decided to reach out to some systems within my Discord who had played Bug Fables and ask for their opinion on how Leif's story was handled. And I'm just going to convey their thoughts word for word. So like with Leif, you could make, in my opinion, a very reasonable argument that Leif is what would be called a traumagentic system, which is a system that forms as a result of some specific event and forms an alter. In Leif's case, his death opens up the space for something to take over his body and control it. Similar to an alter, Leif not being present, due to being dead of course, is, in my opinion, an accidental representation of what we call dormancy, which is when an alter essentially disappears for whatever reason. In Leif's case, the cordyceps fungus, which controls his body, is like an alter being forced to don a persona of someone else. The fungus ultimately deciding to be Leif could perhaps be seen as denying plurality, but I believe it to be a redefining of who Leif is from a singular person to a collection of identities. I hope this makes sense. The other system that I reached out to also had something that they wished to convey. I think the best thing I can talk about is how we felt in the moment playing the game. When we got to the lab area and saw the cutscene where Leif remembers what happened and they talk about it, we had a lot of positive emotions and felt seen in a way that we never have in a game. As a system, we've often felt like trauma we went through killed our original self, and we are now fragments of the person who is living their life. Even though textual events of the game aren't exactly literal to what systems like us experience, a lot of what Leif said deeply resonated with us. The moment you realize you aren't the person you thought you were can be very scary, and the parts of Leif that started speaking in first-person pronouns were reflecting this moment very strongly. The process of coming out as a system can involve a lot of self-doubt and feeling like you're faking. Another way the scene works for us is how closely it resembles the feelings that introjects have, which are system members that are based on an external individual. For example, we have a fictive, which is a term for introjects from fictional media, of Leon from Resident Evil. He often struggles with having memories that he knows he didn't really experience and has a big fear about being accepted as Leon. In a big way, this is what the Leif we see in Bug Fables experiences, not quite the same Leif that he has the memories of being. I'd also like to say that the other members of Team Snakemouth do very well with this information and act exactly how I want friends to be when helping someone through discovering their plurality. They're very affirming and accepting of Leif's experiences. These lines especially make me very happy, saying things like, "It's not like you were faking," and making it clear that she accepts Leif exactly as who he is, not just the original Leifs or a cordyceps, but as both. Like I said at the beginning of this section, I don't know a ton about systems and plurality, but it would appear that Leif is accidentally very good representation for a group that we don't often see in any media, let alone video games. And I think that's nice. Having characters that we can relate to in the art that we consume helps us to feel seen, which is why I am always an advocate for more representation. Well, okay, I'm not always an advocate for more representation because there is a dark side to representation. And I hope by now I've praised Bug Fables enough to build up some goodwill from my audience, because we are going to dive into, in my opinion, the worst aspect of Bug Fables' story, how it handles queer representation. Monsieur Scarlet is a central figure in one of the game's other side quests where he serves as the antagonist and mini-boss. Team Snakemouth has been asked to help take him down because he has been luring other explorers in with promises of a prize and then attacking them. This is a pretty generic children's story type quest until you get to the reveal that he is a gay man who dresses up as a woman in order to lure these explorers in to offer them a prize, and then he ends up revealing that he's actually a gay man and attacking them. This is a very on-the-nose retelling of a transphobic stereotype, and it's kind of disgusting that it made it into the final game. Like, Bug Fables is a game that came out 5 years ago, and yet this is the sort of thing that feels like it comes from a 1980s horror movie like Sleepaway Camp. For those who don't see why this is offensive, the idea of a gay man dressing up as a woman in order to trick someone and then hurt them is a common lie that is pushed by so-called gender-critical feminists who claim that all trans women are simply gay men, disguising themselves as women in order to trick and then hurt women. Moreover, this lie has actually been used to justify the murder of trans women in the United States using the trans panic defense, a legal defense that is still allowed in some states today. The fact that Bug Fables just has this scenario play out straight-faced is, it's not good. It's really not good. I have been told that this is a Kickstarter-backed bug, but I feel like it is the place of developers to say no to blatantly offensive ideas that come from their Kickstarter backers. There's a reason that my Patreon has the disclaimer that I reserve the right not to read out a name if I deem it to be offensive. To be frank, I find blaming this on the Kickstarter backer to be giving the developers too much credit. If they wanted to take the issue seriously, they would have requested the backer rework their character. But the fact that this is the only LGBTQ character in the game tells me that queer rights are not exactly their primary concern. And I'm not docking the game for not having more gay characters, but I do think it is telling that their transphobic stereotype is the only queer representation they have. But I don't want to just be negative, so let's take a look at the revamped combat system, which I think is actually quite innovative and takes a number of departures from TTYD to the extent that I would describe it as a wholly original combat system simply inspired by the Paper Mario one. I mentioned this in both of my videos on the Paper Mario games, but in that series it feels more like you have a singular character than a full party. Mario is the only one with a large degree of customizability, Mario is the only character who has a deep move pool, Mario is the only character to benefit from level ups, and in the first game, Mario is the only character who actually has an HP pool. The various partners you meet on your adventure are instead, from a mechanical perspective, very similar to animal companions. They have a very limited amount of abilities that draw from Mario's own mana supply, because yes, FP is just a fancy word for mana, and they get upgraded by collecting rare materials and bringing them to a merchant, in a similar manner to how you would upgrade armor or weapons in other more traditional RPGs. In Bug Fables, all three of the main characters feel like fully fledged party members, with each of them having very deep pools of abilities that expand upon leveling up. Your mana, here called teamwork points, and your badge points are shared and apply to the whole party, but to my mind there is still enough to separate these three characters out and make them each feel like a complete party member. Not only because they have very deep kits, but because they all feel quite distinct from one another. Kabu is the party's tank. He naturally has a higher HP stat than the other party members, and he can use the taunt ability to force enemies to target him instead of his friends. His basic attack pierces a single point of defense, but in exchange it can only target the frontmost grounded enemy, similar to Hammer from the Paper Mario series. He does have several attacking skills as well, but most of them are just variations on his basic attack. Heavy Strike is a stronger version of it, whereas Run Through can hit all enemies on the ground. Pebble Strike ditches the targeting restriction, but can only deal 1 point of damage, making it even worse than TTYD's Hammer Throw. And Under Strike is probably Kabu's strongest attack, since it pierces all defense and can target any grounded enemy, potentially hitting multiple, but it's also the most expensive at 5 TP, which is a very high value. Kabu does also have the ability to revive downed teammates, which to my mind plays into the paladin-esque tanky archetype that he is slotting himself into. V, on the other hand, feels more like a damage-dealing bruiser. Her basic attack doesn't pierce defense, but in exchange you can also target flying enemies with it. She does have a couple of healing skills, but the real value comes in her offensive ones, which are all multi-hit moves. Unlike in the Pokemon series, in Paper Mario, a move hitting multiple times is a very good thing, as it allows you to gain additional value out of the various damage buffs that you have given your character. Almost all of V's damage dealing skills involve striking the enemy multiple times. And while it's not flashy to have a bunch of skills that are very similar to each other, it is effective because there's a different multi-hit move for each situation. There's the basic 4-hit attack that is the cheapest in terms of TP, the slightly more expensive variant that pierces a single point of defense, or the attack that pierces all points of defense but only has 2 hits. To my understanding, the Bug Fables community considers V to be the strongest of the 3 party members, and most of the meta builds involve stacking damage modifiers on her and having her delete bosses. But if you find that kind of brute force gameplay to be less interesting, the final party member is Leif, and if Kabu is the tank and V is the bruiser, then Leif is the party's mage. His basic attacks use ice magic, which can deal extra damage to enemies that are weak to it, and more importantly, hit enemies who are hiding underground, since neither Kabu nor V can reach them. As you would expect from the magical character, Leif has the most variety in his skills. Some of them are more powerful ice attacks that can either hit multiple enemies or hit a single one with a very high freeze chance. Some of them are protection spells, similar to Veil or Out of Sight from the Paper Mario series, giving one or more party members invincibility for a round of combat. And a large number of Leif's abilities are buffs or debuffs, making him the sort of perfect support toolbox. As you would expect with 3 party members, each of them gets to take 1 turn in each round of combat. However, with the turn relay system, you can choose to have one person give up their action in order to give another party member a second action. However, if that second action is an attack, that party member's might is reduced by 1, and if they get a third action, their might is reduced by 2. Because of this, I typically found that the best strategies involved having all 3 bugs use their actions, but there were exceptions. Because flying enemies could only be hit by V, and underground enemies could only be hit by Leif, I would sometimes use turn relay to allow Leif or V an extra attack. After all, if Kabu's not able to hit the underground enemy, I might as well hit them with Leif, even if it is for reduced damage. However, the other main instance in which turn relay became relevant was if I wanted to take non-combat actions. Let's say I wanted Kabu to land an attack, but also use the taunt command. I could have him use his action to attack so he gets full power, and then someone else could turn relay to him, and he could follow up with a taunt. If I wanted to stack multiple buffs in the same turn relaying to Leif was a good way to do that. And Kabu and V's healing skills were also something that I can see turn relay helping out with, although typically I just used items for healing. Overall, I think turn relay is actually a pretty neat and elegant system. And while I didn't use it too much, I can definitely see other team builds making much more use of it than I did. After all, one of the neat things about the Bug Fables characters is all 3 of them have multiple directions in which their build could go, and a large degree of customizability is left up to the player. You see, while some of the skills that I mentioned are acquired via level up or story events, a large number of them are instead acquired via equipping badges. Actually, Bug Fables refers to these as medals and uses the currency medal points for equipping them, but I know if I try using the word medal, I will accidentally call them badges at least a dozen times. So I'm just going to refer to them as badges to start out with. It's similar to how I refer to ruins and blood echoes as souls. I'm sorry, it's just what the word is in my head. For the uninitiated, badges are items that you can equip to bolster you in some way, shape, or form. Sometimes this is a flat stat increase, sometimes this gives you immunity to status, sometimes it gives you a new skill to use in battle. There's a bunch of different effects. Now, in the Paper Mario games, once you equipped a badge, you automatically get its effect. It's as simple as that. But in Bug Fables, for the majority of badges, you have to choose which one of your 3 party members is wearing the badge and therefore gets that benefit. There are a few exceptions. Some badges impact the entire party, and some badges give a specific character a new move and therefore can only be equipped by one of them. For example, all of Leif's buffing and debuffing badges affect him and only he can equip them. But for the most part, you are choosing who equips each badge, and as a result, you are able to customize all 3 of your characters' builds. I mentioned earlier that the community considers V to be the best bruiser, and therefore tends to put a bunch of damage buffing things on her, but I've spoken to some people who used the other characters instead due to the fact that they have access to AoE attacks. One of my viewers swears by damage stacking Kabu. Sure, he can't hit flyers, but he can hit multiple enemies and pierce defense, so you get the most mileage out of your investment. Personally, I preferred making him into a damage sponge. I gave him a badge that gave him the deep sleep ability, basically meaning that he would never wake up from sleep early, but in exchange, he regains more HP for every turn that he's asleep. Then I used the sleeping cake, which recovers TP and puts the user to sleep, in order to constantly keep him asleep and regaining health while he draws aggro from all of the enemies so that V and Leif could beat them up. I combined this with the badge Favorite One, which meant that he took a little bit of extra damage, but in exchange, anytime he got attacked, both V and Leif boosted their attack stat, and this was incredibly fun to run. Around the midpoint of Chapter 3, I found that it was no longer particularly effective. So I decided to change up my build. I had a bunch of different medals after all. I gave V as many damage buffing badges as I could, and Leif the ability to buff V's combat. After all, I'm experienced in the Paper Mario series, I know multi-hit moves are very strong. But with this strategy, I also found myself struggling. I switched over to making Kabu or Leif my primary damage dealer, and once again, I felt utterly unprepared for every fight. It seemed like I didn't have enough medal points to equip all the medals that I wanted, didn't have enough team points to use special moves often enough, and didn't have enough hit points to survive multiple hits from enemies. I generally don't like grinding in RPGs, so I thought I might be underleveled, but when I did bite the bullet and finally just seek out enemies in order to try to gain experience, I was not gaining that much experience. I think on average an encounter with 3 enemies would get me around 5 to 10 experience, and that to me indicated that at the very least I was on pace for where the game wanted me, potentially even a little bit over-leveled, which was a pretty disturbing revelation to come to because I felt like all 3 of my primary stats were below where I would like them to be. My medal points were low enough that I couldn't equip everything I wanted for the various builds I was trying out. My TP was low enough that after a couple of times using special moves, I would be stuck using basic attacks for the rest of the fight, and my HP was low enough that characters were in serious danger of getting wiped out by just a single round of enemy attacks. In fact, once I reached Chapter 5, there were multiple instances of me getting hit by an enemy's first strike, and from full HP, having a full party wipe before I had the chance to even respond. And this is because if the enemy first strikes you, then every single enemy in the loadout gets their own turn. I did genuinely consider grinding until I was overleveled just because of how far behind the enemies I felt, but your stats go up so slowly that it did not feel worth my time to do so, especially because, I'll be honest, fighting random enemies did not feel enjoyable, instead it felt like a chore. In hard mode, the majority of basic enemies had defense stats, usually 1 or 2, but sometimes even higher. Each of your character's basic attacks deals 2 damage, although who's ever in the front will deal 3 damage instead. This meant that I was really struggling to kill even basic enemies using my standard attack, which is not necessarily a bad thing. After all, just spamming the attack command is generally the most boring way to play through an RPG. In fact, one of the major criticisms I had of Super Mario RPG was that the winning strategy for most fights was just to spam the basic attack. So I do appreciate Bug Fables wanting me to mix up the strategy and use my special moves. I just wish it gave me enough TP that I could liberally use them. Even though TP was the stat that I invested the most in, I found myself running out after 3 or 4 enemy encounters, sometimes even as little as 2. This meant that I would either have to keep a bunch of TP healing items in my inventory, or go back to healing spots after only a couple of fights, and potentially even respawn those enemies if the healing spot is outside of the dungeon I'm in. Now, there are a couple of badges that attempt to alleviate this problem. One of them gives you 4 TP after every battle, and one of them reduces the cost of using skills for just one specific party member. But in my opinion, not only did these come far after the problem had reared its ugly head, but they also didn't do enough to address it. Instead, it felt like slapping a band-aid on an open wound, and because they had a relatively high MP cost, they exacerbated the problem that I had with not being able to equip enough medals. Wait, I accidentally called them by the correct name that time. That legitimately was an accident, but it's kind of funny, so I'm going to leave it in. Not only was every enemy encounter attacks on my TP, but it was also attacks on my party's HP. Because despite expending an exorbitant amount of TP, I was not able to clear full screens of enemies in a single turn. And again, this is not something that I inherently think is bad. In fact, I generally think it's good if you can't just breeze your way through every single enemy one-shotting them. But the amount of damage that these enemies were outputting just did not feel appropriate for the amount of HP that my team had. Leif and V start with only 8 HP, and Kabu has 10, which is a little bit better, but you only gain 1 if you choose to invest in HP on level up, which just feels insulting. But in addition to feeling bad, it also makes your bulk increase at a snail's pace. Certainly much more slowly than enemies' offenses increase. And as a result, it kind of shatters any sense of progression, which is not great in an RPG. In fact, in my non-modified playthrough of Bug Fables, the characters still felt more stagnant than some of the playthroughs I've had of 0% growths or 0 EXP challenge runs. Which is not a great feeling! This was exacerbated by the fact that my character's base damage did not ever go up. The standard attack was always 2 damage, and the special attacks were always operating off of the same bases. In contrast, Paper Mario boosts the damage output of both your jump and hammer attacks at fixed points in the story. Not only does this extra damage mean that you can more easily deal with the tough enemies in the later zones, but it also means if you end up having to go backtrack, you can kick the crap out of enemies that were giving you trouble in the early game. In contrast, anytime that Bug Fables sent me back to an early game area, I still felt depressingly underpowered. It took me 2 attacks to kill a seedling in the early game, and it takes me 2 attacks to kill a seedling in the late game. No progression to be found. I know it's unfair to compare an indie game made by a small team to one of the best RPGs made by one of the most successful video game companies in the business, but this is a comparison that Bug Fables kind of invites. It's got a papercraft aesthetic, it lifts a lot of elements from the battle system, and it constantly makes winks to the audience referencing the Paper Mario games. And as such, I think it's perfectly fair to highlight a crucial element of Paper Mario's battle system that is simply absent in Bug Fables. It's occurring to me now that this was meant initially to be a positive section of the video, but it's kind of become extremely negative. So I want to pivot back to the emphasis on using special moves, because I think it's motivated by a good idea. Encouraging the player to use special moves is something that RPGs should do more often. But if you're going to gate those special moves behind a mana system, you need to either give a much more generous supply, or give much easier ways of restocking mana. The simplest solution is, of course, just to give us a higher TP pool, and I think that all 3 stat pools should be raised a little bit, but I don't think that's the only way to solve the TP problem. Sea of Stars is a game that has a lot of issues, but I think one of the best ideas it brings to the table is your basic attack restoring some amount of MP every time you use it. On the other hand, simply restoring the party's TP at the end of every basic encounter solves the problem of making basic encounters not feel fun, while also maintaining the appropriate amount of mana for the boss encounters. That way, the design doesn't have to be overhauled. Now, I'm not a game designer, so it's possible that there are issues with all 3 of these potential solutions, but my point is that I don't think it is inherently bad to encourage us or require us to use special attacks for basic encounters, but I think that the execution led to a system where I spent the majority of my time running away from enemies because all that they represented was a resource drain. And this is probably the meanest thing that I am going to say throughout the entire review, but I had the exact same feeling running away from the enemies in Bug Fables as I did running away from the enemies in Paper Mario Sticker Star. I was desperately trying to avoid what should be a core portion of the game because I found it incredibly unfun, and it was a huge resource drain that would require me to backtrack to the nearest town in order to restock on said resources. And now, in a desperate attempt to stave off angry comments, I'm going to abruptly pivot to gushing about my favorite part of Bug Fables. Spy Cards is, on its face, an incredibly simple card game. You build a deck out of the various enemies you've seen throughout the game, play whatever creatures you want, and compare their attack and defense to the creatures that your opponent played. Whoever has the highest value deals a point of damage to their opponent, and whoever reaches 0 HP first loses. And as someone who has traveled around the United States playing in Magic the Gathering tournaments, no, Spy Cards is not the most complex card game out there. But what it is fast, addictive, and incredibly satisfying. Each deck includes one boss and 2 mini-bosses, and oftentimes whichever boss and mini-bosses you choose will inform the rest of the cards you put into your deck. For example, if the boss you chose was Venus Guardian, then you were encouraged to play Venus Buds in your deck in order to bolster her abilities. Zasp and Mothia are mini-bosses who are fine on their own, but perform above rate if paired with each other in the same round. And the Spider summons multiple bodies to prevent you from being hard shut down by the Numb status. Numb is one of the many extra effects that cards can have. And it is probably a little bit overpowered, but what trading card game does not have one overpowered mechanic? Numb disables the frontmost creature in your opponent's ranks, which can potentially reduce their team's attack power by quite a bit, securing you the win, especially if you have multiple Numb cards. But Numb is not the only effect out there. Setup raises your attack power next round, so it's planning for the future rather than present payoff. Pierce can lower the opponent's defense, whereas Healing can, well, heal your HP. And the Lifesteal effect restores your HP, but only on the condition that you win that round of combat. However, because it's more conditional than Universal Healing, it's often going to be found at a cheaper rate. But if you want really cheap rate cards, you can find some that have a 50-50 chance of not succeeding. Are these good? I mean, I personally don't think so, but RNG might determine that they actually are. But speaking of RNG, this game is not just that. Obviously, the cards that you draw are going to have an impact on how likely you are to win the game, but there's plenty of strategy to be had as well. You can play as many cards as you want, but you'll only draw 2 new cards every turn. So it can sometimes be worthwhile to only play 1 card in order to save up for a big turn later down the line. Although, on the other hand, if you choose to be extremely aggressive, then you'll draw 3 cards instead of 2 so long as your hand is empty. Also, you can see when your opponent has a boss and mini-boss, because the card backs are a different color than just regular minions. So if your opponent has their boss in hand, that might affect your planning as well. Maybe you go in harder to prevent yourself from losing, or maybe you just decide not to play anything at all, so they throw away their strongest cards and don't really benefit that much from it. A lot of RPGs feature some sort of card collecting minigame, and in my opinion, Spy Cards is a masterclass in showing how to do it right. It's simple enough to not be overwhelming to new players, while also maintaining just enough complexity to make you feel like you are improving as you go through the side quests to fight the various card masters. And I also like how elegantly it's incorporated into the main game. The way that you acquire new cards for Spy Cards is, well, to spy on enemies. This is the equivalent to Tattle from the Paper Mario games. You take a turn off to examine an enemy or boss, and you learn a little bit about them, including their attack and defense stat, as well as their max HP, and now their HP part is visible every time that you encounter them. I like this better than just buying cards from random shops because it encourages you to actually engage with the core gameplay of Bug Fables. I mean, I know I just spent the last 30 minutes complaining about the core gameplay of Bug Fables, but in theory, this is a good thing because a side game encouraging you to engage with the main game creates a sense of cohesion. When you progress during the main game, you're also progressing in the side game to an extent. Once I uncovered Spy Cards, every time I encountered a new boss in the campaign, the first thing I would do was spy on them and then try to figure out what it is that their boss card would do in spy games. It was exciting for me. And obviously encountering a boss in an RPG should be exciting in and of itself, but even if I did enjoy fighting the bosses in Bug Fables, the incorporation of Spy Cards would simply add to that excitement rather than take away from it. As it stands, I wasn't super into the boss fights in Bug Fables, but I was still excited every time I encountered a new boss because of the possibilities for deck building that it unlocked. Spy Cards is so good. Like, I would absolutely play a standalone Spy Cards game. I know that there's a Spy Cards by web thing that you can play against other players in, although from my understanding they have made some mechanical changes to balance it, which I totally understand if you're doing PvP, but personally I think the unbalanced nature of things adds to the single player experience. Like, Num is incredibly strong, but figuring that out is a big level up moment. Meanwhile, the various Spy Card masters that you fight against, having access to bosses and mini-bosses from later in the game that you possibly haven't even encountered yet in the main Bug Fables campaign, can make them seem overwhelming, especially if the boss does some sort of new mechanic you haven't encountered before. But it's fine if your deck is weaker than theirs because they're the computer, so you can probably outsmart them anyway. I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I think an extended Spy Cards full campaign game would be my dream come true. It was the best part of Bug Fables by far for me. But it wasn't the only minigame present in Bulgaria. And unfortunately, it's time for me to get negative again because the story mandated that I play through some truly dreadful minigames. In the second chapter of the game, there's a festival where you need to complete several minigames to progress. The first is a mashing minigame, and I really don't like button mashing. In fact, one of the things that I would praise about Bug Fables is that it has the option to turn button mashing action commands off and replace them with something else, which is why it's weird to me that this minigame isn't replaced even if you turn off button mashing. It is technically optional. If you fail it, you just have to pay some money to get the prize, but it's kind of annoying. However, the minigame that I take greater issue with is the second one, which is basically a whack-a-mole minigame, where you run around throwing your boomerang at the various animals that pop out of the ground. You need to score enough points to win in the limited time you have, but the aiming is incredibly janky, with the 2D art style making it really difficult to tell which direction you're pointed in, and as soon as you throw the boomerang and get it back, you turn in another different direction. I felt like I had a frustrating lack of control, and this resulted in several resets for the minigame. Now, I'll admit, this is definitely the pettiest complaint I've made so far, but I bring it up as a transition into a much larger issue I have with the game as a whole, and that is that the world feels terrible to navigate. The platforming was never great in Paper Mario games, and the same is true of Bug Fables, but Bug Fables seems to rely on platforming more, which is ironic considering that Mario is a platforming series. Each of the abilities also adds to the traversal issues. You get a sprint that is really unwieldy, the aforementioned hard-to-control boomerang, an extremely finicky power to freeze and push water as ice blocks, and for some reason they felt the need to insert block-pushing puzzles with this awful mechanic into both of the instant-fail stealth sequences, which were both mandatory and also just as awful as they sound. But easily the most egregious, the icicle drop. How this works is, in order to navigate across the water, you need to drop icicles that become tiny platforms, jump on the platforms, then drop another icicle, jump onto that one, rinse and repeat about 50 times for each gap of water in slow, excruciating fashion. It makes navigating any dungeon with a significant body of water torturously slow. Especially because if you don't light it up just right, the icicle will fall onto the icicle you're currently on as opposed to into the water. Thankfully that doesn't break the platform you're standing on, but it still adds tedium to the process. And, much like with the boomerang, the issue of your character's direction being unclear and sometimes changing based on other actions still comes up. While moving throughout the overworld does not seem like a huge deal at first, after all, it's just what brings you between the different battles that are the core appeal of the game, I would argue that having an overworld that is at least somewhat fun to navigate is pretty crucial. Overworld navigation is a core part of the gameplay, whether it sells itself as it or not. There is one area of overworld navigation that is noticeably improved over the Paper Mario games, and that is the fast travel system. Until TTYD Remake, fast travel in Paper Mario was always a pretty mixed bag. There were pipes that allowed you to go back to certain locations, either for side quests or mandatory backtracking, but the pipes were not gathered in a singular location, and some towns just didn't get one. Bug Fables, on the other hand, has mine tunnels connecting every overworld area, and they all come out in the same central location in the main hub. It's basically the system from TTYD Remake, and I would not be surprised if I learned that Nintendo was inspired by the way that Bug Fables handled things. And that makes sense. Bug Fables was definitely trying to improve on some of the more common criticisms of TTYD, and the backtracking and lack of fast travel were by far the biggest one. But while I am pleased with the way that they implemented fast traveling, I find their attempts at managing backtracking kind of fall short. And the best example I can come up with for this is comparing the way the two games handle side quests. In the Thousand Year Door, the majority of side quests you have access to come from the Trouble Center. You accept a trouble, you have to go solve whatever problem they have, and you get given a reward. The two major problems with this are usually the reward is not worth your time, just a small amount of money or an item you could otherwise buy, and you can only accept one side quest at a time. So if you're trying to knock out multiple in the same location, you have to go to the Trouble Center, accept the first one, go to that location, solve the quest, then go back to the Trouble Center, accept the second one, etc., etc. Since the majority of side quests were just talk to the correct person, this ends up being an incredibly tedious and unfun way to 100% the game. Bug Fables changes things by allowing you to accept every side quest at the same time. This means if there are multiple quests in the same area, you can knock them out in a single trip. Undoubtedly an improvement, but the quests themselves still are not particularly fun. I'll compare two quests side by side. In my opinion, the most notorious quest in TTYD is the Miss Mouse recruitment. In this quest, at the beginning of Chapter 5, you are required to go back to the first dungeon in the game. You need to go all the way through the dungeon, up to the very top where the boss room was. There's no new enemies, you just go there, open a chest, get an item, then go all the way back to the main hub and recruit a party member. Bug Fables has a remarkably similar mission called My Brother Is Gone, where you talk to a character who says that her brother is missing, and you have to go back to the first dungeon of the game, Snake Mouth Den. You go through almost the entire first dungeon with no new enemies, run into her brother, Dib, and then have to fight off a bunch of level 1, chapter 1 scaled enemies. And that's the entire quest. All you get out of it is a lore book, which is a collectible for a different side quest, so there's not even that much of a reward for the tedium you go through. The fact that both of these quests involve walking through the Chapter 1 dungeon at the beginning of Chapter 5 with no additional complications feels like it was maybe intended to parodize the Miss Mouse quest, but if it was, they kind of just did the thing that people criticize Miss Mouse for, except for didn't even give you a good reward for it. I don't know, the similarities between these two quests are so striking, but the same is true of most of the side quests in Bug Fables. There are a few that stick out as being actually interesting to engage with, specifically ones that offer you optional bosses to fight, but these come with their own issues, even if, unlike me, you like the combat. And that is once again the game's propensity for not communicating with you. At the end of Chapter 2, you get handed a bunch of side quests all at the same time, each of which asks you to hunt down and fight a rare enemy. Each of them is a boss/mini-boss. Now, at the time you're given these quests, you are almost certainly underleveled for these bosses, which isn't communicated to you at all, but I think the bigger problem is regardless of what your level is, you just can't access most of them. I spent about an hour trying to find the Seedling King, who is an optional boss that's listed as located somewhere in Bug Area outskirts. Bulgaria Outskirts is the world for the first chapter, so I figured the Seedling King would be the easiest of these optional bosses, and I wanted to see if I could take him on. After running back and forth, trying with no success to find him, I looked it up on the wiki, and it turns out you can't access the Seedling King until you get a power that you get in Chapter 5. And this is the earliest of the optional bosses you can acquire. If you can't even attempt to fight him until Chapter 5, why do they give you the quest in Chapter 2 with no indication that it's not completable yet? For some other quests, I understand it. There is a long-running quest about Leif's family, which you get introduced to earlier than you can complete it. And that makes sense. Within the plot of the story, it's important to the character, and it shows evolution of their character. But just being told hunt down this creature and not being able to access the creature, but the creature's location is a location you've already been, and there's just no indication that, oh, it's in this secret room you can only access with a power that you get in 5 chapters later. Whew. Deep breaths. This video almost certainly comes off as more disjointed than my usual fare, which is impressive because my videos are almost always very disjointed, one of the consequences of not writing scripts. But this one also suffers from the fact that I've been recording it over a series of months. Every time I record a little bit, I convince myself that I must be exaggerating, that Bug Fables can't be as bad as I remember it. It's a beloved game, and those don't happen by accident. I go back and I try it, maybe out of some false sense of game review obligation, but mostly because I want to like this game so bad. Since I first started working on this video, I've played through TTYD twice, once in the original and once on the remake, and both times I enjoyed myself from start to finish. Some amount of that is definitely nostalgia, but nostalgia can only carry you so far. I also have nostalgia for Fire Emblem 9, and it has quickly become one of my least favorite games in the franchise. So no, I don't think the reason I like TTYD but not Bug Fables is the nostalgia goggles. And I don't think my distaste for Bug Fables is for lack of trying, or because I've grown out of the children's RPG genre. I've tried turning the difficulty down, I've tried following guides, I've tried ignoring side quests and beelining the main story, pun intended by the way. I pushed my way through obvious low points, like the multiple stealth sections that involved terrible block pushing puzzles. I streamed in Discord alongside people who really love the game, hoping that their enthusiasm would rub off on me. But seemingly nothing I can do makes me like this game more. And in fact, every attempt just increases my disdain for it. And that really sucks. Cause I'm a Paper Mario fan who craves more challenge than the original games offer. This game was made for me. This isn't a case of disliking something because it's just not for me. This is tailor-made Danny food. And I still hate it. I hate the individual parts, and I hate the way they come together. And I hate the fact that I hate it because it was made by a team with a lot of passion. It's got an enthusiastic fan base and good TTYD representation, even if it's pretty transphobic in other areas. I don't really have anything else to say, though. I wish that I had some sort of grand sweeping conclusion, but I don't. All I can really say is you can't force someone to love a game they don't like. And that includes yourself. Sorry for the downer ending. I promise that's not going to be a consistent tone shift on the channel, but yeah, this one really bummed me out. If you made it this far, comment code word is Honey Nut Cheerios, so make sure you include Honey Nut Cheerios in your comment so I know you made it to the end, and I'm going to cut to a future version of me that reads my Patreons just because I'd rather be enthusiastic during the Patreon read, and recording this kind of depressed me. Thank you to Michael Kraus, Len, Gameboo, Carosa, Fyrant, Smaz Ruby, Marin McLean, Calamity Callie, Adele, Thaythom, Andu, Reflect, YLO1, Jamie Collins, Mean Jojo, Thick Molder, Arvis, Tailored Muffin, George Grenville the 7th PM, Flohay, Gabe the Green, Controlled Aegis, Roman Kormanczyk, Knickknack Hammersmack, SUP, Caius Cole, Bell Wenska, Die Psych, Ginger, Root Beer Pants, Queen Eliza, Aerith Emblem, and especially my Jenkins, Lilzabeth, Autumn Kelsey, and Julia Kyoto. Y'all make what I do even possible. If you would like to support the channel, there is a link to the Patreon below. Benefits include things like early videos and polls to influence what I make videos on next. But regardless of what you choose to do, I hope you have a wonderful day. Stay safe, gamers.